It was a warm California morning, the kind of still, sun-soaked day that seems almost designed to hold sorrow in suspension. The sky above Los Angeles was a flawless stretch of blue, not a cloud in sight, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park, a quiet but famous resting place for Hollywood's legends, a small crowd had gathered, some in black dresses and tailored suits, others in discreet sunglasses masking red, puffy eyes. But all of them had come for one reason: to say goodbye to a woman who had once lit up the screen with her presence, her laughter, and her unforgettable smile. Loni Anderson wasn't just a television icon. To those who knew her, she was an anchor, a symbol of reinvention, a woman who refused to be boxed in by the blonde bombshell stereotype she had once been cast in. She had fought through personal battles, public divorces, and career ups and downs with grace, charm, and a quiet kind of tenacity that wasn't always visible to the public eye. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But for those gathered here, family, former co-stars, old friends, and fans who'd managed to get access, this funeral was not about her roles or her red carpet appearances. It was about the woman beneath it all, the mother, the wife, the survivor, and, perhaps most poignantly, the companion of a dog who had, in the last chapter of her life, become her shadow in the most literal sense. His name was Shadow, a wiry little rescue mutt with soulful eyes and an oddly dignified air for a dog his size. Loni had adopted him nearly a decade ago from a shelter in Pasadena. According to her daughter, Loni once said she didn't choose Shadow, he chose her. He'd followed her in the shelter, refusing to leave her side, sitting stubbornly in front of her as if daring her to walk away. She hadn't, and from that day forward, neither had he. At premieres, Shadow had been by her side. During hospital visits, he'd curled up on the foot of her bed, alert to every movement and sigh. On good days, he'd watch movies with her, cocking his head during scenes where dogs barked on screen. On bad days, he'd lick her hand when she cried, as if reminding her that someone still needed her to stay strong. He was her confidant, her nurse, her shadow in the truest sense. And when she died, something in him began to change. This morning, Shadow had not been the playful, tail-wagging creature people remembered. He had arrived at the funeral already quiet, almost unnaturally still. He refused water, ignored treats. He sat in the front row beside Loni's daughter, not making a sound, eyes fixed on the casket. Some thought he was trained that well. Others saw something more chilling in his behavior, as if he already knew what the rest were still processing. The funeral proceeded like many others: bittersweet tributes, soft weeping, the occasional moment of laughter as friends recounted Loni's famous wit and sharp tongue. One actor recalled her backstage habits on the set of WKRP in Cincinnati. Another shared a story about how she once comforted a fan having a panic attack during a Comic-Con panel. But it was in the middle of a particularly heartfelt eulogy by her grandson that the silence was broken. A soft whimper. All eyes turned. Shadow had stood up. His body was trembling, but not from fear. Something more electric. He looked up at the casket, and for a moment, he didn't move. Then, without warning, he leapt onto it. Gasps echoed throughout the space. One of the funeral ushers stepped forward instinctively, only to freeze in place as Shadow did something no one expected. He lay down directly on top of the polished mahogany casket, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. His snout touched the wood, then pressed gently as if trying to reach her through it. And then he howled. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a cry. It was something deeper. A sound raw with ancient sadness, primal and chilling. It reverberated through the chapel, so loud and so haunting that it stunned the room into silence. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Shadow's body went still. His head slumped. One of the ushers rushed forward, thinking he'd merely fainted. But within seconds, it became clear this was something else. The vet called to the scene later would use the words acute cardiac arrest, but those closest to Loni, and even those who'd barely known her, felt there was more at play. It wasn't just a medical event. It was a moment, a culmination of something unspeakable and spiritual. Shadow had not just mourned. He had followed her. What happened that day would become one of the most talked about moments in recent Hollywood memory, not because of scandal, not because of controversy, but because of something deeper, a story that felt ancient, sacred, and incomprehensible all at once. News outlets picked it up. Headlines ranging from clinical to poetic filled news feeds for days afterward. Some called it a coincidence. Others called it a miracle. But everyone agreed it was unforgettable. The viral video of the moment, captured by a quiet fan in the back row, exploded online. Not just because it showed a dog reacting with extraordinary emotion, but because it seemed to hint at something humans often forget, that animals love. And sometimes, that love is so profound, it crosses the boundaries we think death should hold. But how did it come to this? What happened in the final days of Loni Anderson's life that bonded her so deeply to a dog that he would die beside her, as if his job was finally complete? Why did Shadow seem to understand the weight of her absence more acutely than any human in the room? To answer these questions, we need to go back, before the funeral, before the death, before even the adoption, to understand the heart of a woman who gave more than people realized, and the dog who gave everything he had left. What if love really doesn't end at death's door? What if, just for one rare moment, we witnessed something that can't be measured in science, but only in soul? This is the story of Loni Anderson, her loyal dog Shadow, and the final goodbye that stunned everyone. What you're about to hear may break your heart, but it may also remind you that love, true, unfiltered, and unspoken, never really dies. Before the dog, before the tears, before the haunting howl that would echo through funeral walls and social media feeds alike, there was Loni. Not the glamorous red carpet regular the world thought it knew, but the girl from St. Paul, Minnesota, whose journey would take her far from the modest neighborhood of her childhood and deep into the heart of American pop culture. Her name became synonymous with beauty, charisma, and television royalty. But the truth, as is often the case with those who smile the most, was much deeper, more nuanced, and sometimes quietly painful. Loni Anderson was born in 1945, in the midst of a post-war world rebuilding itself on optimism and ambition. Her father, a chemist, and her mother, a model, raised her in an era of strict gender roles, where little girls were praised for being pretty and told to be polite. From a young age, it was clear that Loni stood out, not just for her beauty, which was striking even as a teenager, but for the energy she carried. She had a spark that didn't fade with the spotlight. It demanded one. At St. Paul's Alexander Ramsey High School, she was voted Valentine Queen and Homecoming Queen. The other students often talked about her long golden hair and confident walk. But Loni wasn't just eye candy. She was clever, ambitious, and curious about the world beyond her town. She wanted something different. Not just to be known, but to be understood. Not just to be adored, but to be heard. After attending the University of Minnesota, she began taking small roles in regional theater. It was there she discovered that acting wasn't just a means of attention, it was a method of survival. A way of expressing emotions she didn't always have the safety to express in her own life. Roles came slowly at first, scattered and inconsistent. She waited tables, took odd jobs, even worked as a teacher at one point, all while hoping for that one audition that would change everything. And then it did. Sort of. In the early 1970s, she made her screen debut with a small role in the Steve McQueen film Nevada Smith. More parts followed, mostly forgettable characters in television series, the kind of roles that used her face more than her voice. She was pigeonholed quickly. The pretty girl, the secretary, the love interest. But that spark never went out. It wasn't until 1978 that the world really took notice, when Loni Anderson was cast as Jennifer Marlowe in the CBS sitcom WKRP in Cincinnati. Suddenly, she wasn't just another pretty face, she was a revelation. Her character, the station's receptionist, was sharp, intelligent, quick-witted, and, most shockingly for the time, self-aware of her own beauty and the assumptions that came with it. Loni played Jennifer with a nuanced mix of sweetness and steel, giving a generation of young women permission to be both beautiful and smart, desirable and respected. The role earned her multiple Golden Globe and Emmy nominations. But it also did something else. It locked her into a public persona she'd spent decades trying to complicate. America fell in love with the version of Loni they saw on TV. But the real Loni was more complex, more vulnerable, and far more private than anyone knew. In the 1980s and 1990s, Anderson became tabloid gold. Her marriage to Hollywood bad boy Burt Reynolds turned her into one half of America's favorite power couple. The headlines were relentless, the flashbulbs unceasing. But behind the glamour was turbulence. The relationship, by both accounts, was passionate and toxic. By the time it collapsed into divorce, Loni had found herself caught in a storm she didn't ask for. Burt accused her of being a gold digger. Loni, for the first time, broke her silence and revealed years of emotional and financial manipulation. The tabloids spun it as mutual destruction. But to her friends, the truth was simpler. Loni had survived something she hadn't deserved. And she didn't want sympathy. She wanted space and dignity. After the dust settled, Loni did something unexpected. She didn't chase more fame. She didn't write a tell-all memoir, at least not immediately. She quietly raised her children, took occasional roles, and withdrew from the circus. She was no longer interested in being a starlet. She wanted to be a mother, a woman of peace, and perhaps, most of all, someone who lived life on her own terms. It was during this quieter period of her life that she experienced one of her greatest challenges, the battle with illness. In her late 60s, Loni was diagnosed with a chronic lung condition that would slowly sap her energy and force her into early retirement. She didn't go public with the diagnosis immediately. She didn't want the pity, the think pieces, or the media circus. She wanted to face it like she had everything else, gracefully, with resolve, and on her own terms. Her children, particularly her daughter Deidre, became her anchors. But something was missing. A companion, not a lover, not a caregiver, just someone to be there, to sit in the silence with her. That was when she met Shadow. He was a mutt, part terrier, part question mark, found wandering the streets near a shelter in Pasadena, covered in fleas, with visible signs of abuse. He didn't bark. He didn't run to visitors. He barely acknowledged the world around him. Until Loni walked in. Shelter staff later recounted the moment with disbelief. Shadow had been with them for 2 months, and in that time, he hadn't shown interest in a single visitor. But when Loni entered the kennel area, he stood up, walked directly to the gate, and stared. No barking, no jumping, just stillness. And then, when she knelt down, he pressed his head against the bars. Loni didn't ask for a meeting. She didn't browse the other dogs. She simply said, "That's him." Within 2 hours, the paperwork was done. Shadow took time to adjust, but once he did, he became more than a pet. He was a presence. Friends described him as unusually perceptive. If Loni was tired, he lay beside her and didn't move. If she was upset, he sat upright and watched her, tail still, eyes focused. When her lungs made breathing difficult, Shadow would pace, whine, and sometimes bark until she was forced to take a break and rest. It was as if he had one purpose, to guard her heart. And in return, she gave him everything. Cooked him homemade meals, bought orthopedic beds, never left him behind. Not for meetings, not for visits, not even for short errands. If Shadow couldn't go, she didn't go. He was seen as part of her, not an accessory. In her final interviews, Loni often referred to Shadow simply as my boy. Not my dog, just my boy. As the years passed, their bond only deepened. Shadow aged, but slowly, as if time itself refused to separate them. And when Loni's condition worsened, he adjusted his routines. He began sleeping at the foot of her bed all night, not leaving her side, even for food. He ignored visitors. He didn't play. He waited. During one hospital stay, nurses noted that Shadow refused to eat for nearly 48 hours. When Loni returned home, he broke into a sprint across the room, leaping onto her lap, licking her hands as if confirming she was still alive. After that, the two were rarely apart for more than a few minutes. In her will, Loni left instructions for Shadow's care, just in case she died before him. She had arranged for a caregiver, a special trust fund, and even requested that her ashes be kept in a small urn next to his bed for comfort. But she never expected him to follow her. At least, not like that. This was not a woman who took death lightly. She had survived more than her fair share of heartbreak, betrayal, and disappointment. But in her final years, she had found peace, not in fame, not in riches, but in a simple, quiet kind of love. The kind of love that doesn't make headlines until it shows up in a way no one can explain. The kind that makes a dog leap onto a casket. And the kind that makes the whole world stop and ask, what did we just witness? Let us now move from the legend of Loni Anderson to the mystery of her dog Shadow, the final chapter of a bond that transcended words, and maybe even death itself. If you had met Shadow without knowing his story, you might have missed the depth in him entirely. At first glance, he was unassuming, mid-sized, scruffy in the way that suggested he had once known hardship. His fur, a mottled mixture of sandy beige and speckled gray, gave him an almost ghost-like presence when he sat still in the sunlight. His eyes were his most defining feature, dark, expressive, and eerily human in how they seemed to watch, not just look. But it wasn't his appearance that made Shadow unforgettable. It was the way he made people feel, the quiet energy that followed him into rooms. The way he never barked without reason, never demanded attention, and yet always seemed to command the center of it. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was presence incarnate. Long before he collapsed onto Loni Anderson's coffin and broke the hearts of everyone in attendance, Shadow was a survivor. Found limping through the alleys of East Pasadena, he bore the physical signs of a hard life. His ribs were visible through his coat. He had a small healed-over scar behind his left ear, and his right paw curved slightly inward, as if it had once been broken and healed without care. No tags, no chip, no name. When he was picked up by animal control and brought to the shelter, he didn't react the way most strays did. He didn't panic. He didn't bark. He simply sat in the back corner of the cage, as still as a stone. Shelter workers noted that he neither responded to human voices nor made any attempt to engage with the other dogs. He refused food for nearly a day, then finally began eating in slow, calculated bites. For weeks, he remained an enigma. Volunteers came and went. Some tried to walk him, only to find he refused the leash. Others offered toys, which he ignored. Even the most affectionate, enthusiastic visitors couldn't get more than a single blink or tail twitch out of him. Then Loni walked in. By this time, Loni had been searching for a dog for several weeks. But not just any dog. She wasn't looking for a photogenic puppy or a purebred showpiece. She wanted a companion. Someone quiet, steady, someone who had endured a storm and come through the other side. Her daughter had suggested she try adopting, maybe even fostering first, but Loni knew herself too well for that. If she opened her home, even for a week, there'd be no return trip. She wasn't the type to walk away from a soul in need. She entered the shelter on an otherwise uneventful Wednesday afternoon. The staff member guiding her through the kennels pointed out a few friendly dogs, a playful retriever, a bashful terrier, but Loni's eyes kept wandering to the back, where one cage sat apart from the rest. And in it, a dog who wasn't even standing. He was lying there, curled inward, like a folded piece of paper too fragile to open. "Who's that one?" she asked. The staff member hesitated. "That's the stray from East Pasadena. We've had him here a while. Doesn't interact much. We've tried socializing him, but nothing seems to click. We call him Shadow, because you'd never know he was there." Something about the name sent a chill up her spine. She approached the cage slowly, not expecting anything, just curious. But then he did something that no one had ever seen him do. He stood. Their eyes met. No movement, no bark, not even a wag of the tail. But the message was unmistakable. He had chosen. The adoption was completed the next day. The first few weeks weren't easy. Shadow didn't adjust immediately. He kept his distance, slept near the door, and flinched at sudden noises. But Loni never pushed. She let him have his space, let him move at his own pace. She cooked him fresh meals, spoke to him softly, and every night, she'd sit on the living room floor with a blanket, waiting. Sometimes he would approach, sometimes not. But every time, she made it clear. She was there, and she wasn't going anywhere. Slowly, the walls began to crumble. Shadow began following her around the house, first at a distance, then close enough to brush against her ankles. He stopped sleeping by the door and started resting at the foot of her bed. One night, he even jumped up and curled beside her. She didn't move. She didn't say a word. But the tears that rolled down her cheeks that night said more than enough. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. From that point forward, Shadow became more than a pet. He was her silent protector, her confidant, her constant. And in turn, she became his world. He would watch her every move, tracking her from room to room, waiting patiently outside the bathroom door, curling beside her chair when she wrote letters or read scripts. When visitors came, He placed himself between her and them, not aggressively, just watchfully. If she was upset, he was anxious. If she was happy, he mirrored it. They operated like two parts of the same heartbeat. Friends began to notice something odd. Shadow seemed to understand more than most dogs. He obeyed commands she never gave aloud. If she stood too long, he would tug gently at her dress, nudging her toward a chair. If her breathing became labored, he would whine until she reached for her inhaler. When she laughed, he pranced. When she cried, he sat absolutely still, eyes locked on hers, as if trying to absorb the pain into himself. In one particularly harrowing moment, Loni collapsed briefly from exhaustion in her garden. Before anyone else could reach her, Shadow was barking, loud, desperate, and rapid, for the first time in his life. A neighbor came running. Emergency services were called. Loni later said she didn't remember anything except waking up to Shadow's face pressed against hers, his body trembling. That event marked a new phase in their bond. Shadow was no longer just her dog. He was a living alert system, a kind of emotional radar. She began calling him her angel. "You were sent," she'd whisper to him on sleepless nights. "I don't know how, but you were sent." Their bond grew stronger as her illness progressed. Her chronic lung condition made mobility difficult, and Shadow adapted once again. He no longer jumped or ran. He walked beside her with measured pace. He waited patiently during her doctor's appointments, laid outside her door when nurses visited, and always returned to her side the moment the room emptied. Photos of the two of them began to circulate in tabloid columns again, though this time the attention was different. Less scandalous, more admiring. The aging TV legend and her mysterious rescue dog had become a kind of quiet symbol for unconditional love. Shadow had even developed quirks that left people speechless. Once, during a rare public appearance at a local animal rights fundraiser, a baby began crying uncontrollably during Loni's speech. The crowd fidgeted. Loni paused. Shadow stood, walked over to the baby, and gently placed a paw on the stroller. The baby immediately went quiet. The room erupted into gasps and applause. Loni smiled. "He's got a gift," she said. "He knows when a heart is breaking." As the years continued, Shadow's health remained surprisingly strong, despite his rough early life. He rarely got sick, never strayed, and always seemed to know what she needed before she even spoke. Even her children admitted there was something uncanny about him, like he'd been born to be hers, and his only mission was to see her through her final chapter. And when that chapter came, it came fast. In her last week, Loni was bedridden, her breath shallow, her body frail. But she wasn't afraid. Shadow lay beside her without moving for hours. Nurses said they had to physically carry him outside to use the bathroom. He wouldn't leave her, wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. Just lay there, eyes wide open, watching. On the night she passed, the house was still. Her daughter held her hand. A nurse sat quietly by the window. And Shadow? Shadow didn't make a sound. He climbed gently onto the bed, curled beside her one last time, and rested his head on her arm. When she exhaled for the last time, Shadow didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply closed his eyes. It wasn't until an hour later that he stirred, walked to the door, and lay down quietly, as if awaiting what came next. In the days that followed, he barely moved. He didn't eat, didn't respond. He was physically alive, but something in him had dimmed so dramatically that even the vet who examined him said, "He's grieving, deeply." And yet, no one could have predicted what he would do at the funeral. How his grief would not just mirror the mourners, but surpass it in a way no one, human or otherwise, had the words to explain. That moment would soon take the world by storm. But to understand it, to truly grasp its meaning, you had to know Shadow. Not just the dog who died at a funeral, but the soul who lived with quiet purpose, with fierce loyalty, and with a depth of love most people only dream of receiving. The final days of a person's life often take on a unique stillness, a slowing of everything that once moved at the pace of purpose. The world narrows. Priorities reorder. Conversations take on a different texture, more tender, more urgent, more fragile. For Loni Anderson, those final days unfolded like the last pages of a well-loved book, carefully, solemnly, and with an aching kind of beauty. It was the end of a journey not just for her, but for everyone who had loved her in different ways. And at the center of it all, standing vigil like a silent sentry, was Shadow. In early spring, the signs began to show more clearly. Loni's chronic lung condition, which had remained mostly manageable for the last few years, began to take a more aggressive toll. Tasks that once required minor effort became exhausting. She struggled to climb stairs. Walking from one end of the house to the other required long pauses. Her appetite diminished. So did her weight. Though she still kept her signature grace, her frame grew thinner, her cheeks more hollow. Her doctors weren't shocked. She was in her late 70s. The progression of her condition was expected. But to Loni, the realization hit quietly, like a fog rolling in rather than a storm. There was no moment of panic, no dramatic breaking point. Instead, there was acceptance. She began to do what many don't have the strength or clarity to do: prepare. She called her children, not just to update them, but to really talk. Not about diagnoses or timelines, but about memories, about love, about the things that truly mattered. She gave away some of her belongings, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Certain dresses to her granddaughter, a stack of old letters to her son, a painting to her best friend. To each gift she attached a handwritten note. Simple, poignant, personal. Shadow remained close by. He moved less, slept more, and barked not at all. He watched her constantly, as if waiting for her next breath, her next command, or perhaps just her next smile. But Loni didn't give commands anymore. She didn't need to. Their communication had become something wordless. A glance, a sigh, a shared silence. In many ways, they were already in mourning, together. In her last week, Loni made one final decision that shocked even her family. She requested that her funeral be as small and quiet as possible. No media, no red carpet friends unless they had truly stayed in touch. No flashbulbs, just her closest circle and Shadow. There were some objections. A few agents and former colleagues reached out, suggesting a larger celebration, something televised, something worthy of her fame. But Loni dismissed it gently. "I've had a lifetime of applause," she told her daughter. "Let me have a little silence at the end." On her final full day alive, something remarkable happened. The morning had been peaceful. Loni remained in her bed by the window, sunlight streaming in through sheer curtains. Shadow lay beside her, barely moving except to lift his head when she stirred. Her breathing was labored but steady. Her daughter read to her from an old journal, a collection of notes and entries Loni had written years ago during a particularly hard time in her career. Suddenly, in the middle of one entry about gratitude, Loni opened her eyes and whispered, "Play the music." It was an old song, one she hadn't heard in years. "What a Wonderful World" by Louis Armstrong. Her daughter found it on her phone and played it softly. Loni closed her eyes again, a tear slipping down her cheek. Shadow's ears perked up. He stood, slowly, and nudged his nose under Loni's palm. She didn't move, but her fingers curled instinctively into his fur. They stayed that way for the full 3 minutes of the song. The house was silent except for the music and the occasional creak of the floorboards. When the final note faded, Loni exhaled deeply. Not a struggle, just a letting go. Then she slept. That night, her breathing slowed to a whisper. The nurse monitoring her vitals knew the signs. The family was called in. They sat quietly around her bed, each person holding a piece of her life in their hands. Memories, regrets, whispered thanks. But no one dared speak above a whisper. It felt sacred, and Shadow, still as stone, didn't leave her side once. At 4:03 a.m., Loni Anderson took her final breath. Her daughter was holding her hand. The nurse gently checked her pulse and nodded. No one wailed. No one screamed. It was not that kind of death. It was the kind of passing that felt like a slow dissolve. A soul slipping through the veil without resistance. Peaceful. Whole. And yet, as serene as it was, something about the room changed immediately. The air grew heavier. The silence deepened. Shadow stood up. For the first time in hours, he moved. Not in panic, not in fear, but with purpose. He walked to the head of the bed, looked into her face, and let out a soft whine. Just once. Then he backed away and lay down at her feet. He stayed there for the next 11 hours. Even after the body was cleaned and prepared. Even after the undertaker arrived. He refused to leave until she was taken from the house. When the casket was finally wheeled out the door, Shadow followed behind it with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't cry, didn't bark. just walked as if his own heart was being carried with it. The days between her passing and the funeral were muted. Her daughter stayed with Shadow constantly. He ate very little, refused to sleep on the couch or his bed. He paced. He waited. Every time the front door opened, he looked up, as if hoping she might return. But he didn't seem confused. It wasn't that kind of waiting. It was the kind of waiting you do when you know someone is gone, but some part of you isn't ready to let them go. On the morning of the funeral, Shadow was dressed in a black satin ribbon around his collar, a simple gesture chosen by Loni's granddaughter. He walked into the chapel quietly, no leash required. He sat in the front pew beside the family, eyes fixed on the polished casket that held the woman who had given him everything. He didn't move during the eulogies. He didn't whimper during the prayers. He simply watched. When her daughter stood to speak, she paused and said, she called him her angel. And in the end, he became something more. As the ceremony moved toward its final moments, the chapel fell into a moment of soft stillness. A pastor began to speak about eternal love, about loyalty, about how sometimes the deepest connections defy explanation. And that's when it happened. Shadow stood. At first, no one thought anything of it. Perhaps he was shifting his weight. But then he walked forward, right down the aisle, eyes locked on the casket. Someone reached out to stop him, but Loni's daughter whispered, "Let him go." He reached the steps, paused for a breath, then leapt. It wasn't a dramatic leap. It wasn't wild or reckless. It was graceful, intentional, and somehow inevitable. Shadow landed gently on top of the casket and lay down. Just lay there, head resting gently on the wood. His body didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't bark. He was still. The pastor froze. The room collectively held its breath. Then Shadow let out a sound, a single, low, aching howl. Long drawn out. Not loud, but piercing in its purity. It wasn't the sound of a dog calling for attention. It was the sound of a soul unraveling, of a goodbye that no one could have prepared for. And when the sound ended, Shadow let his head fall completely flat. He didn't move again. Panic set in. One of the ushers rushed forward. A vet, who had been attending the funeral privately, came to the front and knelt beside the casket. A stethoscope was pulled from her bag. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked up at the family and whispered, "He's gone." Gasps. Stifled sobs. Some in the room simply sat in silence, stunned into stillness. No one could understand it. No one could explain it. But everyone who was there would say the same thing for years to come. Shadow didn't die. He followed. There's a certain kind of silence that only falls at funerals. Not the everyday hush of a quiet room, not the meditative calm of early morning, but a heavy, breathless stillness that seems to press down on everything. It is the sound of grief suspended in the air, hanging between glances and whispered condolences. On the morning of Loni Anderson's funeral, that silence met the warm Los Angeles sun like oil and water. The birds still chirped. Cars still moved through distant city streets. But inside the chapel at Forest Lawn, the world had paused. The service was held in the Hall of Liberty, a place many in Hollywood knew well. Over the years, it had hosted the farewells of countless icons, legends whose images were forever burned into the American imagination. But on this particular morning, it belonged to Loni. Not to the myth or the actress or the tabloid subject, but to the woman. The woman who, for those gathered, had meant something real. The guest list was short by design. Loni had left clear instructions. No media circus, no red carpet, no posturing. If someone hadn't spoken to her in the last 5 years, she didn't want them there. Her daughter followed her wishes to the letter. Still, the room was filled with faces that, to most, would be instantly recognizable. There was Tim Reed, her co-star from WKRP in Cincinnati, who had once said she made every day on set feel like home. Howard Hessman's widow sat beside him, clutching a white lily in both hands. Several cast members from Loni's lesser-known shows came too. People who had shared green rooms, dressing trailers, and tired lunch breaks with her over the years. A few producers, now gray-haired and walking with canes, arrived quietly, heads bowed. From outside Hollywood came others who had known her privately. A school friend from Minnesota, her old hairdresser, her longtime publicist, who had stood by her through both career highs and the messy tabloid years. And there, front and center, was her daughter, standing tall, dressed in black, her eyes weary but dry. She had wept for days already. Today was about honoring, not unraveling. And then there was Shadow, dressed in a black satin ribbon that matched the one Loni had worn to her last gala. Shadow entered with quiet dignity. He didn't need a leash. He didn't tug or bark or resist. He simply walked at her daughter's side, as if knowing instinctively what this day was. His gait was slow but steady, every step deliberate. As he passed each row, attendees looked down at him, some with small nods, others with moist eyes. They all knew who he was. Some had seen him over the years in Loni's arms at events. Others had heard the stories. But today, he was more than just a dog. He was the symbol of something few could articulate and none could ignore. The service began with soft music, a simple piano rendition of Moon River, one of Loni's favorite melodies. It was followed by a short reading from her granddaughter, who recited a passage from a letter Loni had written decades earlier. It's not the laughter I'll miss when I go. It's the quiet, the space between the noise where love truly lives. There were no video montages, no dramatic highlight reels of her acting career. Loni had requested instead that people share stories. And so they did. Tim Reed stood and recalled the time Loni, newly divorced and emotionally gutted, had shown up on set determined to act like everything was fine. She walked in like nothing was wrong, but her hands were shaking. I noticed. We all did. She had this brave way of hiding her pain. But what got me, he said, voice cracking, was when she turned to the crew, smiled, and asked, "How's everyone doing today?" That was Loni, carrying her own weight and still asking how yours felt. A childhood friend told the story of a school play gone wrong. Loni had forgotten her lines and improvised an entire scene, making the audience laugh so hard that they gave her a standing ovation. She was 12, the friend said. 12 and already stealing the show. Then came her daughter. She didn't read from notes. She didn't rehearse. She simply stepped forward, placed a small photo on the podium, a black and white snapshot of Loni with a much younger Shadow in her lap, and said, "My mother didn't live to impress. She lived to connect. And for the last years of her life, she connected most deeply with someone who never said a word. Shadow." All eyes turned to the dog sitting beside the casket. "I used to think she was just spoiling him," her daughter continued, voice steady. "Making gourmet meals, talking to him like he was a person. But one day, I watched him alert me to Mom's breathing change before the monitor did. I realized then he wasn't a pet. He was a guardian. And she trusted him in ways she didn't trust anyone else." She paused. "And I think, maybe I do too." There was a long silence after that. The pastor offered a brief eulogy. Nothing over the top. Just words about love, about kindness, about how some people live lives that are loud and bright, while others shine in quieter, more enduring ways. He ended with a quote Loni had once written in a card to a friend recovering from surgery. "When the world starts spinning too fast, hold on to love. It's the only steady thing we have." Then came the closing music, Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World," the same song Loni had requested in her final moments. As the opening chords began to play, people bowed their heads. Tears came freely. The mood in the room softened from somber to almost reverent. And that's when Shadow stood up. He took a single step forward. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, with a grace that defied logic and training, he climbed the steps toward the casket. Gasps echoed softly. A few ushers moved instinctively, but froze mid-step. Shadow didn't hesitate. He leapt. Landing atop the casket, he didn't slide or falter. He positioned himself directly above where Loni's heart would be. And there, in the center of it all, he lay down. His eyes were open, his head low, and then he howled. Not loud, not violent. A low, vibrating moan of pure sadness. A sound that rang deeper than words could ever reach. People cried openly. Some covered their mouths. One guest sobbed into their hands, whispering, "Oh my God." And just as suddenly as it began, the howl ended. Shadow slumped. He didn't move again. There was a rush to the casket. Her daughter stepped forward, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. A woman in the front row whispered, "He's gone too." A man in the back stood and left, overwhelmed. The vet who had quietly attended the funeral as a guest came forward. She knelt beside the casket, placed her stethoscope against Shadow's chest, and listened. Her face was a study in disbelief and sorrow. "He's passed," she said. And with those words, the room changed. The air felt heavier. Time stood still. It was not just a funeral anymore. It was a moment unlike any other, shared, witnessed, and etched into memory by those who had been there. They didn't remove Shadow immediately. At the family's request, he lay with Loni for the remainder of the service. People came forward not just to say goodbye to her, but to him. They placed roses, whispered prayers, and ran fingers across his fur, still warm. Later that day, the family would make a decision that surprised even them. But in that moment, all they knew was this: something sacred had happened. Something that no camera could truly capture, no headline could fully explain. Love had taken its final form, and left with her. Some moments aren't meant to be described. They're meant to be witnessed, felt, absorbed. They exist outside the ordinary reach of words. You try to recount them, and the language falls short. That was the kind of moment the leap became. It wasn't simply a dog jumping onto a coffin. It was something deeper, something primal and otherworldly, something that seared itself into the minds and hearts of everyone in that room and far beyond. It started with a simple movement. A rustle, the faint creak of paws against polished floor. The music had reached its second chorus. Louis Armstrong's voice, rich, gravelly, full of soul, floated through the chapel. I see trees of green, red roses too. As those words danced through the air, Shadow rose. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate either. He simply stood, his eyes locked on the casket like a compass needle fixed to its true north. The chapel fell utterly silent. Even the music seemed quieter somehow. The collective inhale of the room was audible, like the sharp draw of breath before a plunge. Then, without breaking his gaze, Shadow began walking. Down the center aisle. Alone, his ribbon trailing slightly behind him. Step by step, he approached. Some people whispered. Others gasped. Phones weren't raised. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. It was too sacred, too strange, too real. At the foot of the altar, Shadow paused. His head tilted slightly. There was a split second, just a heartbeat, where it seemed he might stop there. Simply sit. Maybe whimper. Maybe press his nose to the base of the casket. But then he gathered himself and jumped. It wasn't a frantic jump. Not like a dog desperate for affection. This was measured. Precise. He leapt with purpose and landed softly on top of the coffin. A perfect arc. No stumble. No scramble. He landed as if he had practiced the motion 1,000 times. As if it were preordained. That's when the energy in the room changed. Everyone felt it. It was like the air thickened. Like the room had become heavier. Not in a suffocating way, but in a way that made people straighten their backs, lean forward, listen closer. It was as if something had entered the space that wasn't visible. Something ancient. Something holy. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't move again. He simply lay down. One paw curled under his chest. His head slowly lowered until it rested gently atop the smooth wooden lid. His body stretched along the length of the casket, aligning with her form beneath. And then he let out the sound. A howl. Not a scream. Not a sharp, yelping wail. This was low, deep. It vibrated through the floorboards and through the bones of every person there. It wasn't just noise. It was a message. A mourning. A goodbye. People would later say that it sounded less like a dog and more like a soul unraveling. As though grief had taken on a sound wave and echoed itself through Shadow's body. There were no words to describe what came next. Just the collapse. Shadow's body loosened. His breathing, already shallow, stopped altogether. His limbs went still. His ears flattened. One final exhale drifted from his snout like the last sigh of a candle before it goes dark. He didn't twitch, didn't convulse. There was no struggle, just stillness. Her daughter was the first to reach him. She fell to her knees beside the casket and placed a hand on his head. It was warm, too warm to have been gone for long. A moment passed, then two, and then she looked up with trembling lips and said, He's not breathing. One of the guests, later revealed to be a veterinarian who had known Loni through a pet wellness charity, approached. With practiced grace and utter silence, she checked Shadow's pulse, his heart, his breath. She looked at the daughter. He's gone. The words didn't land with a crash. They landed with a shudder. It was too much, too surreal, too poetic to be accidental. A few people began to cry, full sobs echoing through the once quiet room. Others simply covered their mouths, their eyes wide. Even those who hadn't known Loni personally, who had come because of professional ties or distant affection, were visibly shaken. The scene had shifted from a touching farewell into something mythic, something eternal. The pastor, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward and said something quietly that only the front few rows could hear. "I've officiated hundreds of funerals," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like this." The service didn't continue as planned. There were still closing words to be said, final blessings to be offered, but they didn't feel necessary anymore. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken, not in language, but in the actions of a creature who didn't know how to lie. Eventually, the room emptied out slowly. People lingered by the casket, not wanting to leave, not wanting to move past what they had witnessed. Some knelt beside Shadow, stroked his fur, whispered words they couldn't bring themselves to say to Loni herself. "He loved you," someone whispered. "Tell her we miss her." "Good boy." The family didn't remove him immediately. For nearly an hour, he lay there undisturbed. The mortuary staff, too stunned to suggest otherwise, simply stepped back. The flowers were rearranged to make space. No one rushed. No one interrupted. It became a vigil of sorts. A woman who had once graced magazine covers, attended premieres, and been the object of national fascination had received the kind of goodbye that no amount of celebrity could buy. It was pure, raw, honest, and it had come from the only soul who had loved her without condition, without expectation, without the filters of fame or performance. When they finally removed Shadow's body, it was done gently, with reverence. He was placed in a soft blanket and carried out by her daughter and two close friends. They didn't speak during the walk to the car. They didn't need to, because everyone understood something unspoken. That leap, that howl, that moment on top of the coffin would become the story. It would be the one detail retold at every dinner table, every podcast, every documentary about Loni Anderson from that point on. It would eclipse awards and headlines and even scandals. It would be the truth of her legacy, that love, real love, can break the rules of life and death. Some guests would later call it spiritual, others divine. A few would chalk it up to coincidence, the result of stress, timing, grief. But even those people never forgot what they saw. In the days that followed, messages flooded online spaces. Hashtags trended. The leap became shorthand for something both unspeakably sad and beautifully tender. People shared stories of their own pets, their own losses, their own final goodbyes. But none quite matched the image burned into those who were there. A dog, a coffin, a single leap, and a silence that would echo forever. In the immediate aftermath of Shadow's collapse on Loni Anderson's casket, there was no wailing, no chaos, no explosion of grief in the traditional sense. Instead, the chapel sank into something far more haunting, a long, low tide of disbelief. The collective grief in that room, already thick and heavy with mourning, deepened in an instant, folding in on itself like a wave crashing inward. It wasn't the kind of moment that lent itself to noise. It was a moment that demanded silence. At first, people simply froze. The veterinarian who had stepped forward with clinical instinct confirmed it again, more softly this time, more reluctantly. "He's passed." That sentence didn't echo. It didn't need to. It sank immediately into the hearts of everyone in attendance. And it hit them differently than Loni's passing had. She had lived a full life, they reasoned. She had fought through her final days with grace, and when the time came, she had slipped away with family at her side. But Shadow? He wasn't supposed to die. The mind struggled to process it. Some guests found themselves blinking rapidly, as if trying to wake from a dream. Others leaned into their seats, clutching the wood with white knuckles, the weight of witnessing something so tender and so tragic anchoring them in place. For several long minutes, no one moved. Her daughter, Loni's eldest, stood beside the casket, staring down at the still, limp body stretched across her mother's final resting place. She had not cried during the speeches, not when the music played, not even when the casket was brought in. But now, something in her broke. Not in a loud, cinematic way, but in the quiet slump of her shoulders, in the way her knees slowly buckled beneath her. She knelt beside Shadow and placed one trembling hand on his fur. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The room watched, not wanting to intrude. Tim Reed stood near the back, his eyes red-rimmed. He placed his hand over his mouth and looked toward the stained glass window above the altar. A deep breath escaped him, shaky and uneven. He had delivered eulogies before. He had said goodbye to many friends. But never like this. Whispers finally began to spread. He knew. He waited for her. Did he die from heartbreak? Some guests looked toward the front doors, as if they might need to leave, to break away from what they were feeling. But no one walked out. Not yet. Instead, they remained rooted to the floor, wrapped in a moment that felt far too sacred to abandon. The funeral staff, seasoned professionals accustomed to the mechanics of grief, hesitated. Normally, there would have been a schedule, a list of next steps, closing words, flower placement, final respects. But now, with Shadow's body lying atop the casket, everything had shifted. Nothing felt appropriate anymore. There were no words that could be spoken, no protocol to follow. The pastor, visibly moved himself, stepped to the podium. He looked at the crowd, then back at Shadow, and said quietly, "I think, perhaps we are meant to be still right now." And so they were. Still. For over 40 minutes, the chapel remained quiet. Shadow lay unmoving. His body settled into peaceful stillness, his fur rising and falling no longer. Some guests found themselves praying without realizing it. Others simply stared at the ceiling, eyes wet with tears, struggling to understand what they had just seen. Outside, the groundskeepers paused in their duties. Word had spread. A dog had leapt onto a casket. A dog had howled and died. Even in a cemetery used to mourning, the story made its rounds quickly. A few curious staff members stood just outside the chapel, listening for sounds they couldn't quite identify. But all they heard was quiet. Eventually, the family decided. Shadow would not be removed right away. One of Loni's grandsons, barely 20 years old, stepped forward. He approached the casket, knelt beside his mother, and whispered something to her. Then he stood and faced the room. "I know this isn't normal," he said. "But my grandmother was never normal either. She was something different. So is he. I think we should give them this." And that was all. No one argued. No one raised concern. For the next hour, the guests filed slowly toward the casket, laying flowers, whispering prayers, offering farewells. Not just to Loni, but to Shadow too. Some placed their hands gently on the dog's back. Others touched the casket with reverence, as if trying to absorb some last trace of what had been lost. A former producer from her sitcom days pressed a small photograph into the edge of the flowers, a snapshot from a 1980 cast party. On the back, he had written, "Thank you for making us laugh, and for teaching us how to say goodbye." A nurse who had cared for Loni in her final weeks cried openly, her hands trembling as she stood over them. She had witnessed the bond between woman and dog up close, had seen Shadow refuse to eat, refuse to sleep, unless Loni was in sight. "I knew they were close," she murmured to no one in particular. "But I didn't know it was this deep." Outside the chapel, more guests arrived late, unaware of what had occurred. They entered quietly, only to freeze at the sight before them. A few gasped. One man, an old friend from Loni's early modeling days, sank into a pew, whispering, "Dear God." Meanwhile, in the back of the room, a journalist who had been granted permission to attend in a private capacity took quiet notes. Her hands shook. She wouldn't file her article until days later, but the headline would read, "Hollywood's quietest farewell ends with a final, unforgettable act of love." As the final notes of background music drifted off and the chapel lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the conclusion of the service, the family gathered near the casket one last time. The funeral director approached gently, asking if they were ready. Loni's daughter looked at Shadow, then at the director. "Not yet," she said. It wasn't until the sun began to shift through the stained glass, casting golden patterns across the floor, that they made the decision. Shadow would be carried out with Loni. Not beside, not behind, with her. The mortuary staff paused. That wasn't standard, but nothing about this day was. One staff member, an older man who had worked at the cemetery for decades, spoke softly. "Let me help." He retrieved a second set of gloves, not for protocol, but for ceremony. With the utmost care, he and Loni's daughter gently wrapped Shadow's body in a soft white cloth, embroidered with gold threads. Then they placed him in the space just above Loni's chest, nestled safely in her arms. A blanket of flowers was laid over both. No one spoke as the casket was slowly wheeled out. Guests followed in complete silence, not because they were instructed to, but because anything else would have felt wrong. Outside, the air had cooled. The clouds had gathered slightly, casting long shadows across the garden paths. As the casket was carried toward the hearse, shadows ribbon fluttered in the breeze, catching the eye of every onlooker. People lined the sidewalk. Strangers who had never met Loni. Some had heard whispers. Others had seen posts online within minutes of the event. They came to witness, to honor, to simply be present. And as the hearse doors closed, a hush fell over the cemetery grounds. Panic had given way to reverence. Grief had matured into something deeper. And the silence was no longer heavy. It was sacred. This was no longer just a funeral. It was a farewell of the rarest kind. It didn't take long for the world to find out. In the age of social media, even the most private of ceremonies can ripple outward in ways no one anticipates. Though Loni Anderson's funeral had been carefully planned to remain intimate and protected, one moment, raw, unscripted, and beyond imagining, would not remain confined within the chapel walls. Within hours, the world would know. And within days, it would mourn with a kind of collective ache rarely reserved for anyone outside royalty or heads of state. But what made this different was that it wasn't just about a famous actress. It was about love, real love, and its tragic, unforgettable echo. The first wave came just 90 minutes after the funeral ended. A local sound technician who had helped set up the chapel's audio had quietly taken a single still photo near the end of the ceremony. He hadn't planned to share it. He simply wanted a memento of what had, even before the leap, already been a poignant farewell. But after witnessing Shadow leap onto Loni's casket, howl, and die, he sat in his car in stunned silence for a long time. Then, with trembling fingers, he posted the photo to his private Instagram, captioning it, "I've never seen anything like this. A dog just died on his owner's coffin. My heart can't take it." Within minutes, the image was screenshotted, reposted, and shared again. A public Twitter user shared the image alongside a brief summary of what they'd heard from a cousin who had attended the service. This happened at Loni Anderson's funeral. Her dog jumped on her coffin, let out a heartbreaking sound, and then died. At first, the reactions were what you'd expect: disbelief, confusion, assumptions that it was fake or exaggerated. But then others who had attended the funeral began posting, not photos or videos. No one had dared film the moment, but simple confirmations. "I was there. It happened. Still trying to process it. I saw the dog jump. I heard the howl. I saw him stop breathing. Her dog died from heartbreak." That's the only way to describe it. By the next morning, the story had gone global. Every major news outlet covered it. CNN led with the headline, "Grief or Miracle? Loni Anderson's dog dies moments after jumping onto her casket." The Guardian framed it more poetically, "A leap of love. Hollywood says goodbye to Loni Anderson and her dog." TMZ, true to form, took a blunter approach. Dog collapses and dies at actress's funeral, real or staged? The internet responded with overwhelming emotion. Tens of thousands of posts poured in. People shared their own experiences of pet grief. Photos of dogs lying beside hospital beds. Stories of cats who sat by windows for days after an owner's passing. Videos of animals reacting to recordings of deceased loved ones. The conversation turned from the specifics of Loni's funeral to a much bigger question. Can animals die of a broken heart? Hashtags began to trend globally. Hashtag Shadow and Loni. Hashtag The Leap. Hashtag Love Beyond Life. Celebrities who had never even met Loni weighed in. Ellen DeGeneres tweeted, "There's something about animals that humans still don't understand." What happened with Loni Anderson's dog Shadow is both heartbreaking and beautiful. Viola Davis called the moment a holy act of grief. Meanwhile, news anchors, podcasters, and columnists scrambled to provide context. Animal behaviorists were brought on air to explain what could cause such a phenomenon. Some described it as stress-induced cardiac arrest. Others cited a condition known as broken heart syndrome. In animals, a reaction so powerful that the animal's body simply shuts down in response to overwhelming emotional loss. Dr. Miriam Halberd, a renowned animal psychologist, gave an interview on Good Morning America that struck a chord with millions. "We've seen it before," she said. Bonded animals have been known to die shortly after their companions pass. Cats who die after their sibling is gone. Dogs who stop eating after their owner dies. But what made this case unique was the timing. The deliberate nature of it. The jump, the howl, and then the stillness. If you had scripted it, no one would have believed it. And yet, it happened. Still, not everyone accepted the story at face value. As the story spread, a second wave of reaction emerged, one tinged with skepticism and even conspiracy. Some suggested the event had been staged, that Shadow had been drugged, that perhaps this was a Hollywood stunt designed to memorialize Loni in the most dramatic way possible. A well-known podcast host speculated aloud, "It's too perfect. It reads like a scene from a movie. A famous actress, a loyal dog, a funeral, and then death? It's emotionally manipulative, almost too cinematic to be real." But those who had been there pushed back hard. Her daughter issued a statement 2 days after the funeral. No part of this was manufactured. Shadow was family. He didn't perform. He loved. What you saw wasn't theater. It was devotion. She didn't grant interviews, choosing instead to let the moment speak for itself. But that single statement silenced many critics. Those close to Loni began sharing private details that reinforced the truth of the bond. A family friend posted a photo of Loni holding Shadow as a puppy, her face glowing, eyes wet with what looked like happy tears. She used to say she didn't save him. The caption read, "He saved her." An old interview clip resurfaced, one that hadn't aired during its original taping, in which Loni, speaking softly into the camera, said, "Shadow watches me like I'm his entire world. And honestly, some days, he's the reason I keep going." The public response was overwhelming. Fan mail poured into the family's home and Loni's former fan club. Letters from as far as Iceland and South Africa arrived, filled with condolences, stories, poems, and sketches. Artists painted tributes to Shadow lying atop the casket. A street artist in Venice Beach created a mural, a large, ethereal image of Shadow howling under a night sky, with the words, "She didn't go alone." The ripple effect went further still. Within a week, multiple animal rescue centers reported an uptick in adoption applications. Some cited the story directly. "I want to save a Shadow," one applicant wrote. "I want to give that kind of love." Grief support groups began incorporating discussions about pet loss into their sessions. Animal behaviorists were suddenly in high demand, answering thousands of emails from people who had never processed the deaths of their pets fully. One of the most striking developments came when a well-known publishing house announced it had secured the rights to compile a book of stories inspired by Shadow's final act. Tentatively titled The Leap, Tales of Love, Loss, and the Animals Who Stay. The collection promised to gather essays, poems, and real-life stories from around the world. But not all the responses were about mourning. Some leaned into awe. Religious leaders gave sermons about the sacred bond between humans and animals. Spiritual podcasts explored the possibility of animals having souls intertwined with their humans. Philosophers weighed in, discussing whether loyalty like Shadow's was evidence of a consciousness that transcended survival instinct. In one widely shared video, a Buddhist monk from Kyoto, Japan, explained through a translator, "When a dog like Shadow dies on the body of his human, it is not an accident. It is emerging, a soul choosing to leave when the other does." In our tradition, this is seen as a sacred union, a perfect departure. Eventually, conspiracy theories faded. The noise settled, and what remained was the core of the moment, love. Love in its most raw, unfiltered, and undeniable form. In a world increasingly skeptical, increasingly digital and disconnected, one untrained dog had reminded millions of something painfully simple. That love, when real, refuses to let go quietly. That grief isn't always human. That sometimes, in the silence after a song, a leap can say everything.